Good afternoon. Welcome to another episode of Rogue Insights by Primeberg Inc. My name is Kevin Duskett, president of Primeberg Inc. Today, we are finally moving away from the Israel-Iran drama to talk about our good old friend North Korea. As of yesterday, I believe, the 12th, although it might have been the 13th over there, tensions on the Korean Peninsula, have once again spiked as North Korea has placed all of its artillery forces on high alert following accusations, which appear to be true, that South Korean drones infiltrated North Korean airspace, specifically that they may or may not have flown over the capital of Pyongyang. South Korean observers and officials and international North Korean specialists have kind of mixed alarm and skepticism in relation to this. So we're kind of seeing a situation in which history is sort of repeating itself for North Korea. But as of right now, Kim Yo-jong, the sister of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, basically promised, quote-unquote, terrible calamity for any further South Korean provocations. And this mirrors much of a language that North Korea has historically used to raise the stakes during periods of tension with the South. You know, North Korea has a very long history of posturing, whether it's with artillery barrages, shooting at fishing boats, launching ballistic missile tests, etc. In fact, North Korea has long used military posturing to manipulate diplomatic negotiations. We can go all the way back to the armistice agreement following the Korean War in 1953. A potent example is the 2010 Yeonpyeong Island shelling. North Korea basically launched an artillery attack that produced South Korean military and civilian casualties for no really clear reason other than engaging in brinkmanship to basically project its power and force. This is a pattern that's very often linked to periods of diplomatic deadlock, international negotiations stalling, whether it's over denuclearization, sanction relief, military exercise, etc. North Korea will basically escalate tensions by threatening military action, and this is a cycle that then is followed by diplomatic outreach, and, you know, it's widely seen as being part of the survival strategy of the Kim regime. Now, what is interesting in this specific case is that it does appear, although it's unconfirmed, that the South Koreans were actually flying these drones over sovereign North Korean territory. So the timing of this specific threat regarding placing all of North Korean artillery on high alert is a little interesting, in as much as with everything that's going on in the Middle East, North Korea could be trying to leverage international distractions plus this incident, which is certainly not occurring for the first time, to enhance its negotiating position. Typically, North Korea has basically used moments of global political tension or transition to try to escalate to de-escalate, but not in the way Netanyahu is doing, in a way that actually benefits the Kim regime's survival. So I guess in a way similar to Netanyahu, but also North Korea is basically trying to get relief. For example, in 2017, North Korea tried to accelerate its missile program under President Trump, and basically that was to see what it could get diplomatically from a brand new president. But the threat here is, if we look at where North Korean artillery positions, fortified artillery positions, are placed along the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, this line, this yellow line, what we're seeing is the range of North Korean artillery. And we can very clearly see that major South Korean cities, including the capital of Seoul, Incheon, Chuncheon, Gangneung, Cheongan, Wonju, are all well within artillery range of North Korean weapons. So when North Korea puts its assets on high alert, and this kind of shows you the mirror view of it vis-a-vis China, basically a third of South Korea, the most populated part of the country, is under direct threat of North Korean artillery barrage. And it's believed that if ever the North Koreans were to launch a war against South Korea in the future, that it would be preceded by a massive artillery barrage that could, in theory, produce massive civilian casualties because of the fact that these South Korean population centers, including Seoul, which is not in the most dangerous area like Chunwon or Yeoncheon or Incheon, but could still be pretty devastated. And also, when Kim Yo-jong, the sister, has made public pronouncements like this, the regime has historically followed through with increased military posturing, if not outright action, from troop movements to missile tests, even cyber attacks aimed at South Korea. So let's kind of talk about what North Korea has and what it could potentially do if this were real. Just to introduce you to some of their weapon system. I didn't pull this one up, but the M1978 Kutsan is a very, by North Korean standards, potent self-propelled artillery gun. Can fire 60 kilometers, putting a lot of South Korea, including Seoul, within range. These are some of the largest caliber guns in the world, and they're basically a cornerstone of North Korea's artillery forces along the DMZ. They also have a large number of 240 millimeter multiple rocket launchers, MLRSs, which can launch large-scale barrages that can saturate an area with explosives and kind of basically produce firestorms of pure hell. It's estimated that North Korea has between 10 and 14,000 artillery pieces deployed near the border or in range of South Korean territory from the positions that we are looking at here. And this is everything from 170 millimeter self-propelled guns to 240 and 300 millimeter multiple rocket launcher systems. As I was saying, the Koksan is basically the most formidable of the current North Korean artillery pieces. If it uses rocket-assisted projectiles, it can shoot 60 clicks. Seoul has 25 million people. You do the math. Basically, if North Korea wanted to, and this would obviously bring utter devastation and the death of the regime in the long term, but it could launch tens of thousands of artillery rounds into South Korea, a lot of them hitting Incheon and Seoul within an hour of initiating a conflict. And this is based not on the quality of North Korean artillery, but on sheer numbers, right? So if we look at the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, and the line, you can see that this 160 mile long, 2.5 mile wide buffer zone, which separates North and South Korea, basically has entrenched and hardened artillery positions that are linked by underground tunnel systems, which simultaneously represent a defensive preparation and a significant offensive capability against South Korea. So even if the South Koreans and U.S. forces were to mount a counteroffensive immediately subsequent to such a barrage, the fact that these positions are hardened would make this very challenging. So North Korea's military strategy is very artillery-centric. So when these forces are put on alert, even if it's posturing, it does represent a real threat because of the sheer amount of firepower that North Korea could unlaunch on South Korea in such a short period. At the same time, we do have to take into account that North Korean artillery is for the most part antiquated. A lot of the systems in use today were first introduced in the 70s and 80s, and they don't have the tech upgrades that we see in modern artillery systems, notably precision-guided. They have some rocket-assisted munitions, but not very much precision-guided stuff. The 240 millimeter MLRSs can be effective for area bombardment and saturation bombardment, but they don't have precision capabilities, so there's a high risk of them being inaccurate and inefficient against highly mobile forces. At the very same time, however, if they're launched against a densely populated urban area like Seoul, no matter what they hit, they're going to cause destruction. Now, we've seen a resurgence of artillery in recent times. I'm going to get into this in a little bit. In Ukraine, both Russia and Ukraine have been using significant amounts of artillery as we've seen the world's I guess you'd say, largest scale conventional conflict, not counting the Gulf War because it's kind of hard to balance, since Korea, probably. And a lot of precision-guided munitions and counter-battery radar, which I'll get into in a little bit, is being used there. North Korea is not doing that. It's lobbing shells into the air and counting on the density of the South Korean population to hit stuff. That said, North Korea produces a hell of a lot of artillery shells, and even though they're providing a lot to Russia right now, in as much as the calibers kind of line up, there are reports of shortages of ammunition, food, etc., within the North Korean forces. Moreover, as it pertains to targeting systems, most North Korean stuff is done manually. That could mean a caliper, a paper map, etc. And there is a notion that a lot of North Korea's artillery is in massive disrepair, and it's unknown to what degree they're actually combat ready. But when we combine the tunneling systems with the 240mm MRLRSs, the M1978 Koksan with that 50 to 60 kilometer rockets propelled range, it is a significant threat. Now, the question of whether it's real or not is something we're going to get into in a minute. But let's talk about artillery in Ukraine. Artillery, for a while, was kind of dead. It was used, but because we were fighting so many counterinsurgency conflicts, it didn't play that significant of a role. In the Battle of Fallujah in Iraq, for example, in 2006, 2007, artillery strikes were being called in danger close in support of Marines, but it wasn't like the mainstay of the battlefield. I was at West Point in 2006 or 7, not attending, visiting for a conference, the Student Conference on United States Affairs. And this was right around the time that the cadets were getting the senior cadets were getting their assignments. Everyone wanted the infantry. Getting the artillery, unless you were like a total nerd engineer type, was like the worst possible thing you could get back then. But artillery is making renaissance in Ukraine. Both Russia and Ukraine have relied heavily on artillery barrages to wear down fortified enemy positions, control territory, disrupt logistics, etc. This has been especially prominent in the Donbass, where we've seen massive artillery duels, kind of epic if you look at the footage, with the sides using everything from howitzers to MLRSs to more modern systems, HIMARS notably, to soften enemy positions before ground forces move in. But what's distinguishing the situation in Ukraine from the one in North Korea is precision-guided munitions, UAVs, and counter-battery radar. As it pertains to precision-guided munitions, artillery shells that are equipped with guidance systems, like the M982 Excalibur used by NATO and provided to Ukraine, these can hit targets with pinpoint accuracy and minimize collateral damage while maximizing strategic impact because they have GPS and inertial guidance. Similarly, UAVs like the Turkish Bayraktar TB2 can be used for reconnaissance and targeting, and thus allow these precision munitions to be directed onto specific enemy positions with unprecedented accuracy through ISR and CO2IC. Now, when we compare this to North Korean artillery is stuck in the past, as is Russia's to a lesser extent. Their munitions are unguided across the 240mm and 300mm caliber, and they are absolutely not integrated with modern surveillance and targeting systems, and this limits their potential effectiveness in terms of pinpoint precision strikes. And this is a critical weakness in North Korea's military doctrine as it pertains to using artillery to support ground troops. That said, if it was taking on, again, a saturation barrage against northern South Korea near the DMZ, it can lob something pretty much anywhere and hit someone and kill civilians. So as long as it manages to keep these batteries sustained with actual munitions, there is a pretty decent chance that North Korea would be capable of doing something should this alert that these artillery barrages or batteries have been placed on is actually true. And let's look at a few counterfactuals about what North Korea could be aiming for. The most likely of these is simply that it's looking for diplomatic leverage. It's opportunistically making use of what's going on in the Middle East, combined with the South Korean incursions, to basically extract concessions from South Korea, the United States, or even China to either alleviate economic pressures from sanctions, or to gain something, or to signal to the domestic population that the regime is strong. With U.S. presidential elections coming up in about a month, Pyongyang could just be aiming to kind of test the waters, possibly hoping for more favorable terms, whether it be Trump or Harris that's elected. Another possible explanation is, of course, internal distraction. North Korea has been struggling with massive economic challenges that have been exacerbated by sanctions, and it's still dealing with the fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic. And Kim Jong-un, like his father and grandfather, has often used external threats to kind of solidify his internal control. So this fiery rhetoric that we're seeing from Kim Yo-jong could just be part of a broader effort to showcase the regime's strength domestically and kind of deflect these domestic issues. It could also be testing an international response. That's a third counterfactual, basically seeing how the U.S. and South Korea will react to this to kind of push tensions without triggering a military response. So by putting the artillery units on high alert, based on this accusation of the South Korean drone incursion, which appears to be true, it could be an attempt to see whether Seoul or Washington would basically blink first, given that North Korea has historically been pretty decent at walking that really fine line between provoking and entering into full-scale conflict. If it escalates tensions just enough to provoke a reaction without crossing the threshold into war, it's another way by which it can obtain future concessions. There is, however, and this is a remote possibility that I do not believe to be true, that the North Korean leadership could be fearful that it's losing control of the situation. With drone technology becoming increasingly accessible and North Korea not really having it, while South Korea has amazing ISR capabilities, the idea that South Korean drones could violate North Korean airspace, especially close to Pyongyang, could be a direct threat to the regime's authority, could create some degree of discreditation within the population and thus challenge the regime's viability. So if we're kind of evaluating these counterfactuals, the most likely possibility is that this is a nothing burger. North Korea has a massive history of engaging in dramatic threats that simply materialize into nothing. Kim Yo-jong, that's Kim Jong-un's sister's language, may be aggressive, but North Korea has historically stopped short of direct military action, as we saw with the 2017 nuclear standoff, where the rhetoric went crazy, but ultimately de-escalation prevailed through back-channel diplomacy. If we look back to 2010 at Yeonpyeong, North Korea took military action, but it was super limited, and it didn't escalate into a larger conflict because of the fact that South Korea kind of knew what North Korea was doing. Given that North Korea's military strategy is premised on deterrence, essentially preventing the South or the Americans from attacking, which is why North Korean artillery batteries are placed in this kind of reign of terror over South Korea, this is probably more likely deterrence than anything else. Any artillery strike on South Korea would cause immense damage and civilian casualties in South Korea. But in the long term, the response from the U.S. and what could be, shall we say, pulled back together of the South Korean armed forces, especially once American forces got into theater, would be the decapitation of the North Korean regime. So any large-scale military action would lead to regime collapse, which is probably the biggest threat of the Kim dynasty. With this happening, as the 2024 U.S. presidential election is just a few weeks away, as tensions in the Middle East are off the chart, this is very, very likely to be a nothing burger. North Korean artillery is massive in scale, and it could produce immense physical and civilian casualties during any actual war, but really psychological terror is the main function of these weapon systems. The North Korean leadership and military leadership is aware of this. And if we take into account North Korea's historical behavior, the most likely outcome of this round of escalation, no matter how dramatic it is that they've placed their forces on this supposed level of readiness, is that we're just going to see another cycle of escalation followed by de-escalation. And now to go back to Netanyahu is quote-unquote escalating to de-escalate. But he's never actually de-escalating. When we look at North Korea, we actually do see this cycle of small escalations, concessions being granted to them, and then them going back to being quiet for a while. So it is a bit of a different dynamic. So if we summarize this, North Korea's recent threats are kind of scary or alarming, but they're a very familiar thing that is part of a pattern of military posture that is in all likelihood aimed at gaining diplomatic leverage. It does have a large but highly outdated artillery arsenal that could provoke massive damage in a sustained barrage, but as tensions rise and fall in the Korean Peninsula, as usual, it's better to not overreact, to take everything with a grain of salt. I don't think there is any clear sign of all-out war, no matter how alarmist the North Korean messages are. But hey, you never know. I dropped some good books if you're interested in reading further about this in the description. We've got The Brink by Mark Ambinder, I.F. Stone's The Hidden History of the Korean War, which kind of looks at the roots of why North and South Korea are still technically at war. And Andrew Scobell's North Korea is a military threat, which discusses its conventional forces and its WMD together and kind of gives you a great picture of its military capability. So check those out. Go visit our website, follow us on social media, share this with a friend, drop a subscribe, a like, ring that bell, all those things you do. Share a friend, enemy, frenemy, whomever you want. But it is currently 2:35 p.m. here in Calgary, Alberta on October 13th, 2024. Thank you so much for hanging out and hope you have a wonderful, wonderful day.